Thank you everyone for listening and sharing this podcast with others. We love to hear from you as we are preparing for Season 2 programs, and we value your input and appreciate your continued support. You can send us an email, a message on LinkedIn, or send a voice message. Remember to explore continuing education programs on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. We actually have a live CE webinar on January 26th taught by Dr. Myrna Mejia on cognitive behavioral therapy for chronic pain with Hispanic clients. Hope to see y'all there. Now on to today's episode. Putting theory to practice and relational psychotherapy framework and incorporating an anti-oppression lens can look unique based on the therapist and the client's identity. So what might relational psychotherapy look like in session when working with queer and trans clients of color? How can we be clear about positionality, embrace humility, and be willing to explore intersectional identities of queer and trans clients of color? And even in a case of adolescent and identity development, how can we listen and center the experience to queer and trans clients of color? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Zen. Our guest today is Jordanalam, a licensed clinical social worker based out of Seattle. As a queer Bangladeshi American and South Asian American therapist, Jordan specializes in trauma treatment, especially amongst queer and trans clients of color. Additionally, Jordan is a consultant and trainer to therapists and birth workers. Jordan graduated from Barnard College and for graduate training, the Smith School for Social Work. Jordan was also an APA Division 39 scholar. As part of their multiple roles, Jordan is also a writer, and their essays and short stories have been published in The Atlantic, Seattle Met Magazine, Autostraddle, and The Rumpus, amongst others. Today, Jordan will be speaking with us to explore what theory looks like in a relational psychotherapy framework and incorporating an anti-oppression lens, especially in working with queer and trans clients of color. Jordan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited and glad to have you on this episode. You know, we just haven't had a lot of conversations about the queer and trans community, and I do think it's important to create a space to talk about population's needs, and more importantly, the intersectionality between queer and trans community and being a person of color. And so before we get into some of that, why don't you walk us through your personal journey, share any memorable events and circumstances that influenced how you got into this work?
Yeah, I always say that I was doing relational work in my career before ever approaching being a therapist, and probably even in my personal life as a young person before ever even hearing about psychology as a career path. I was often the friend that would be the one with the listening ear or the extra few bucks to get more taco time and to talk you through your breakup. And now, after I went to college where I did get a creative writing and psychology degree, started working in domestic violence response as an advocate and also working as a doula, a birth doula. And both of those careers are very intense in the moment because you're supporting someone through some of the most transformational parts of their life, whether in a downward sense of like losing everything or in an upward sense of, experiencing this really intense, beautiful moment that ideally has a healthy baby at the end. And working with folks through that, I think that I became really intuitive to what people are needing and wanting in that moment. And so that's really translated into my graduate school work, learning how to be a therapist and slowing down that process, lengthening the relationships from being in, a couple of days maximum of seeing someone through their birth or a couple of weeks with domestic violence survivors to having years of time to develop a relationship with someone.
Yeah, yeah. So seeing a need and how you naturally gravitated towards these roles. And I would imagine it must have been such a unique and beautiful process to see, the being a doula, right? Be a
Mhm.
part of this transformative stage for the parents. Now, can you share with us a little bit more about specifically how did it get into the relational psychotherapy frame and working with queer and trans clients of color?
Yeah. So relational psychodynamic theory, which, I think of as a long term that is very fancy, but really just signals back to seeing relationships as the site of change and comes from the psychoanalytic tradition. So I think of, it's not pure psychoanalysis in the sense that it's incorporating other kinds of theories. There's been a feminist critique of psychoanalysis that gets incorporated into psychodynamic thought. And when I was looking at graduate schools, I originally was like, I don't know where I should go. I don't know exactly what I should be doing, what mode feels like the right fit. But I was dissatisfied with a lot of the more manualized treatments, or dissatisfied with some of the more behavioral focused treatments, or at least the ones that exclusively focus there. I think they can be really useful pieces. And what I noticed in my community of queer and trans people of color is this sense of we are impacted by structural forces. We are impacted by, you know, racism. We are impacted by sexism. We are impacted by queer phobia, all of those pieces. And those modalities focused a lot on the individual. They focused a lot on the sense of you can control your own experience of the world if you just learn how to cope with it or change your mindset. And I know I'm oversimplifying that, but it looked to me on the outside like that. And so when I was looking at schools, I actually found Smith, which focuses on relational psychodynamic therapy. And it felt like it incorporated more of that lens of how structures of power and oppression impact us and how we can live with those realities while still feeling like we are empowered in ourselves.
Can you share with us some specifics in terms of what might that look like? What do you feel relational psychotherapy can bring for queer and trans clients of color?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because I've done a lot of thinking about it in my last several years working with this population pretty centrally. Is that I think there's a huge acknowledgement and a not looking away from the grief that can be felt by this community, that we are more likely to experience traumas early in life, higher ACEs scores, a lot of these impacts that carry lifelong. There are not models for some of the relationship formations that we are now pioneering. I think in a younger generation right now, there's more visibility of like different kinds of families and different kinds of, poly relationships and different kinds of sexualities and whatnot. But I know for me, even not that long ago, this sense of there is one hetero rubric and one, white heterosexual rubric for what it looks like to have a successful development. If we think about like childhood development stages onto adulthood development stages, it's like, well, if you're not heading towards marriage, if you're, a late bloomer, quote unquote, and not interested in marriage at all, or interested in a long-term relationship even, then you're kind of adrift. And so to me, I think about it as like relational therapy can offer that sense of creating an alternate, creating your own definition of what it looks to have a successful adult development pattern. And also, because I'm a trauma therapist, looking at those pieces where there's been core wounding, both from maybe individuals in your life and also institutions, and how that creates coping mechanisms. Your resiliency is coping with that, but maybe those patterns are no longer serving you. And how do we set that down or acknowledge them and not look away from them?
Oh, I really love that. It's, growing up, you're noticing that, gosh, if I identify as a queer and trans individual, and as we see in the media, even textbooks, even reading books. Like, I have a daughter, I'm trying to find just books to read to her. And it's hard, really, to find books that represent people of color or LGBTQ plus communities. It's very difficult. You have to actively seek that out. And so when you don't see it, you don't read about it, or it's hard to access, there is this internalized shift of, well, I don't quite belong. I must take this path, marriage. Of course, there's this big debate about is marriage. Uh, so, wow. And it's very empowering too, as you're describing it, saying, I'm going to create this new path that works for me. I'm going to develop relationships with myself and others that makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'll add too that I think that, we block out the queer and trans community as like one community, but there's so many communities within it, not only different racial communities, but even those first two words, queer and trans, it's like they cross over a lot, but a gender journey in your adulthood, having essentially what is a second puberty for some folks, if they're experiencing like they want to take hormones, they want to have surgery, or they want to have some other transformation in the social perception, whether or not they're using medical modes at all, is like, that is a huge impactful journey that someone's going on. And they're doing it at an age where, compared to when you're in your teen years and there's a whole cohort of people, around you going through the same journey, it can be isolating. It can feel really hard unless you have trans community, unless you have some resources to feel supported in that work. So I just want to highlight that specifically because I think you're right. It's like, who's modeling a gender journey, and let alone a gender journey for like a person of color, maybe like a Black trans person, who's telling that story and how accessible is it? And if you don't see that modeled, or you don't have a supportive space to land in therapy or in your community, how would you move through that in a way that feels healthy and well?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for adding that, because that is so central. It's like developmentally, you're going through two puberties or two phases of development. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. Now, tell me a little bit more about your work, because you're going to be starting a solo practice in January, and it's opening for adults and couples. Why don't you share with me more about your clinical practice and consultation?
Yeah, thank you for that. In the last couple of years, I've been working at Interconnections Healing Center, which is in Seattle. It's a group practice of primarily queer and trans people of color as practitioners, and we're very social justice focused. And I really loved being at that place while I was an associate working towards my licensure hours, and now feeling this real drive to create something similar, but all of my own, because in solo practice, I'm really excited to be able to hone in on a population that I really want to work with, which is the queer and trans community of color, and also to hone in on working with folks who have experienced generational trauma. So I have worked with folks who have had acute trauma experiences, complex trauma experiences, and then adding on this piece around generational trauma, which I think threads through a lot of what people are experiencing, but the sense that we're carrying some of the things that our ancestors have left behind for us, particularly thinking about immigration stories, particularly thinking about the ways in which maybe like I'm an adoptee and I work with other adoptees who feel like they don't have access to their stories. So they have to go on their own journey about what that means to define oneself without access to their family of origin. So that was an incredibly specific example, but I'm thinking about the ways in which we are holding on to the remnants of what might have been unhealed in past generations.
Thank you for creating that space for other folks, because as I'm thinking about this, and I've heard, other podcasts and other interviewers or essentially professionals who talk about being adoptee and how that in itself is also very isolating. You've really gone through some really tremendous events, challenges, uh, just being who you are.
Yeah. It's interesting when you're living your life and you're like, oh, this is just how I've experienced the world. And yet, when you have the mirror held up to yourself, I know in my own personal therapy that when that mirror was held up to me, of like, this is actually not normal, or this is actually astounding that you had to build the skills and the tools and the resilience to move through that, then it becomes this interesting thing where you get to grieve the fact that you didn't have the easy path. Because when you're in it, I think I think my clients actually reflect this too, is this sense of like, I'm just grinding. I just got to get through this. And there's no room for feeling. And so I think something that we do is we slow down in session and we have to talk about what it means to feel through that. Not to say all of these identities or experiences cause grief alone. There can be a lot of great joy and identity formation in them. And I think that we don't spend enough time with the painful feelings of it. And I think that sometimes that allows you to move into a new space of changing your own patterns now when you know, okay, this is where I'm coming from. It is extraordinary. How do I then move forward from here?
So, as our listeners are, just thinking about these ideas, the population, and working with this population and connecting them with resources, or if they are actively working with queer and trans community, I think something that is unique from my own experience being in the Asian community, the conversation about being queer and trans is in itself a stigma. And so it is very unfortunate. And I hope there's more awareness. And so there is that intersectional issue or barrier that comes up with mental health care. Not only is it just being Asian community, as it identified Asian, it's like, oh, we don't seek treatment because it's disrespectful to talk about our family outside. Um, and so then add to that being queer and trans. And so I'm wondering, when you're working with populations of color, what are some considerations you might incorporate or build into therapy?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think about the first thing that came to mind of many things is that what you just described, I think about as the collectivist mindset, or this idea that, for Asian Americans and then also for other people of color, this sense of, okay, well, me acting out or being different is somehow a betrayal of community. And so I think that there's this tension always between needing something that is for you individually, like let's say you want to and need to go on a gender journey in order to feel good in your own body and to feel like you're walking through the world in a way that you want to as a person. And that is in conflict with that collectivist sense of, okay, well, I'm supposed to honor my parents. I'm supposed to conform to a certain norm because that is what I'm expected to do. And for some people, that's, stronger or quieter, depending on their relationship between individualism, collectivism, and whatnot. But I think that there's a lot of fear and terror around moving away from the collective in some way, being isolated, being ostracized, whether or not someone actually gets ostracized by their parent or family or community directly in words. There is that fear and anxiety of like, what does it mean to move and break away from the whole?
Yeah. Yeah. So you're saying paying attention to that and also acknowledging that may not actually happen, which is the community may not actually
Mhm.
actively reject you. However, that is a fear that is carried. And it makes sense because, again, it's just not talked about, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
right.
Okay.
And it's like that positionality, I think, is the other piece I'll add is like, I think that there are these rich community conversations that are happening in people's bedrooms, that are happening in community spaces between queer and trans folks themselves. But when you get out of that bubble, then you see that there's not that much literature, that there's not that much access for people who are supporting a loved one through coming out or whatnot. And, I think that we sometimes look through the positionality and the lens of dominant, straight, even straight people of color as, who is get access to how they want to interact. But I think what I love to do in my therapy is like, how do we take your lens as the primary lens? You are the expert of your own experience. and we're going to cater to you first before going back to that dominant positionality.
Ooh, it also requires us to reflect upon our own positionality when we are presenting in therapy with our clients.
Yes,
Huh.
yes, that's a huge part. Just to tie it back into relational psychodynamic therapy is like, what I really enjoy is that one of the things that pushes back on traditional psychoanalysis, or at least Freudian psychoanalysis, is the idea that we are not blank screens. We are not trying to be detached or not insert ourselves in the room. Contemporary psychodynamic theory, and this is going to get a little heady for just a second, but I'll bring it back. It talks a lot about the intersubjective space between two people or between multiple people. And so we're attendant, or at least I feel like I'm always attendant to how I'm showing up in the room as a person, you know, as a South Asian person, as a middle class person, as all of these identities. And how does that impact your experience of me, even if you're not verbalizing it? And vice versa. How are we always interacting with power, whether we're talking about it directly or not?
It's always something that's actually, it's not in the background, it's actually in the forefront as you're navigating
Yeah.
the space. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Huh. Now, thinking about this work as well, what is one recommendation you would give to therapists or professionals in the field of mental health who work with clients or students of color and identify as either queer or trans? What would you recommend?
Mm. I'm taking a moment here just because I want to be really thoughtful. And I think that it kind of goes with what I was just speaking on, of that sense of we're always in the room, in the sense that I know a lot of therapists that have talked to me in consultation about feeling afraid to bring themselves into the room, feeling afraid to kind of let go of that expert hat and admit that they don't know something, or to come into the room and acknowledge their own identities because it feels a little personal, feels a little risky to state where you're coming from and your positionality. And I'm not advising this sense of, you know, you got to tell your life story, but I do think that there's something really important about acknowledging that difference, acknowledging where our stories align and don't align, and how that's impacting our work. I think it brings us into closer relationship and allows that person to trust you more. And yes, a practitioner should do their own research and should have a base of understanding so that the client doesn't have to explain everything to you. And I also think some of the most powerful work that I've done is when I've acknowledged with a client, like, hey, we may have similar identities even, but my experience is going to look different than yours. And what does it mean for us to work in that space of questioning, confusion, you know, shared themes, even if we don't have the same experience?
Huh. Ooh, what a rich conversation I would imagine that must have
Yeah.
elicited. Yeah. Yeah. In your career as a person of color, what were some challenges you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
Yeah. I think that similar to so many other therapists of color that I know, I went to internships where it was majority white, if not all white. And, you know, I was the only person of color there. And I had to feel like I was explaining myself to other people. And I think this also became something, you know, we had a wonderful critical mass at Smith of radical people of color who would push back on this. And that was great. But it was also still in the context of a predominantly white institution where some of the time in classes, just because you're the one visible brown person or the couple of visible brown people, you become like a surrogate TA to the professor because you're explaining things, even though you're there to learn, you're explaining things about your experience to them, to the class. And Honestly, I think that that is something that has happened throughout my life, is having to grow up fast, essentially, of not getting that precious developmental stage of being able to be taken care of by the professor in this case, or, by the institution in some form. It's always reacting against or pitted against in some way.
Yeah, that's actually quite common, what you've mentioned, which
Mhm.
is being a person of color and having to educate colleagues and professors. I'm actually wondering, just a thought came to mind for me, and that is, personally, how would you like that dynamic to play out? Like, is there another way around it if,
Mm,
let's say, I'm the only Asian American student in the classroom and someone is actually curious, they just don't know not enough about my experience, or somehow the assumption that my experience represents a group
right.
of Asian Americans. Personally, for you, what might be a way around that, or to address that issue?
Yeah. I think that one, I am always open to have generous conversations with people who have humility, who are not sort of taking from me. That I think is one piece where I think some people approach me in a way that's not very humble, in a way that's treating me more as a resource than as a colleague. And so that's one of the pieces on the interpersonal individual level. But on an institutional level, I actually also think that professors and internships and whatnot can do a lot more to set the groundwork so that we're not swimming upstream. And what I mean by that is, when, like we were talking about with books that are representative of a lot of different experiences, that would be amazing if that was just the base of how we are learning, using cases that are about people of color, using cases that are about, maybe quote unquote one type of person of color, one ethnicity, but have different experiences, so that we're not having to do the labor of presenting that as an alternate to what is already presented to us.
Totally got it. Yeah. You make it the norm. You don't have to bring it in as an outside reference, as an outside material. No, this is just part of the curriculum. This is just part of the experience. Hmm. Well, Jordan, do you have anything else you'd like to share with us? Any other thoughts?
I think I'll add something that I didn't talk about for my practice, and also that I would love to provide consultation for other therapists, just as a form of advocacy, is that I provide gender confirming services letters. So one of the barriers to institutional healthcare for trans folks is that you need to have letter from two different people to say basically that you are of sound mind to make decisions about having a gender affirming surgery, or whatever other healthcare procedure that might be requested, so that it'll be funded by insurance. And so I provide that to the community at a sliding scale cost, whatever you're able to pay, all the way down to $0. And I'm also happy to talk to other providers about how to write those letters effectively. I think it's useful because, since it has to be two people, sometimes people already have access in their main therapy relationship. Maybe they have a therapist or a doctor that would be willing to write one of those letters, but they have to get another evaluation from someone else. So I provide that evaluation. We can get into the politics of that. I feel like that's a huge institutional barrier, especially for people who already are struggling to even access healthcare at all. But I want to say that one of the things I do is trying to make that barrier at least a little bit less. And these services, from what I understand, I can provide them in the state that I'm working in, which is Washington State right now.
Great, great. Well, we'll definitely provide your contact information on our show notes. And so, how would you like listeners to reach you?
Yeah, you can email me if you want to work with me for therapy or consultation work at jordanalam.therapy@gmail.com. And I'm sure that'll be put in the show notes. And then otherwise, you can take a look at the column that I'm writing for the Seattle Times. It's called The Therapist is In, and the written version is on seattletimes.com. And you have to be a subscriber if you've used your 3 free articles, but there's an audio version that you can click through on SoundCloud, and you can listen to that whether you're a subscriber or not.
Great. I will definitely include that. Now, Can people also access your previous published work? Because, I think it's
Yes.
really important to highlight not only our clinical work, part of this is also the creative work that we have as mental health professionals. I'm sure we have creative outlets. So anything we can do to support each other.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder. My website has been fully updated for the new practice, and it has all of that. So it is jordanalam.com.
Well, Jordan, I'm really excited for you, and you are amazing. And, I really wish you well in having a thriving practice, and more importantly, a practice you feel centered in doing.
Thank you so much. This was such a rich and lovely conversation.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you like what you've heard, please share and subscribe to our podcast, People of Color and Psychology. Other ways to support us include registering for continuing education courses or making a donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. We value your input and appreciate your continued support. You can send us an email, a message on LinkedIn, or send us a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.